What's up, guys? Welcome to Contending for Christ. I want to look at the goat and the ram of Daniel chapter 8. The goat and the ram of Daniel chapter 8. But first, I need to say this, that throughout my research, throughout my studying and everything, I do look at some apocryphal books. I do look at some extra biblical books. By doing so, I'm not saying that they're divinely inspired like Scripture is. But what I am saying that is there is some historical information we could glean from it and sort of piece together some details that we don't have in Scripture. Josephus's work, Herodotus's work, Xenophon's work, 1st, 2nd Maccabees, some things like that. But also very wary because the Apocryphal will have false teachings, false doctrines in them as well, such as 1st or 2nd Maccabees talks about baptisms and prayers for the dead. That is not biblical. That is found nowhere in Scripture. I don't agree with it. But as far as the historical purpose is, some of that may be true, and I use that to go ahead and piece together some of this stuff that we're going to discuss. But again, apocryphal books, extra biblical books, I'm not saying they're divinely inspired. There's just some information that we might be able to be useful to us from it. But enough of that. Daniel chapter 8. If you remember chapter 7, we talked about the four kingdoms, the four beasts that Daniel saw coming out of the sea. You had the lion, Babylon, the bear, Medo-Persia, the four-headed leopard, which was Greece, and then this fourth kingdom, this terrible, dreadful beast with iron teeth and brass nails. We see that fourth one is the Antichrist kingdom. Today we're going to specifically be looking at the bear and the leopard, the bear being Persia again, the leopard being Greece. So we're going to start off in verses 1 and 2, where Scripture says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai." Now, what's wonderful about Scripture is God does not shy away from the details. God will give us times, periods. He'll give us locations, exact names. And so if you ever want to test the veracity of Scripture, the truthfulness, the accuracy of Scripture, you can use details like this to make sure they're accurate. And so one way you could tell that Scripture is legitimate is we're going to talk about in chapter 5, but Belshazzar being referenced as a king of Babylon. Many people for a long time thought that was in error. That was not true, that there was no Belshazzar that was a king, that his father Nabonidus was. In Scripture, God tells us Belshazzar was king. So what do we make of that? Well, just like the Hittite Empire and Pontius Pilate, archaeology uncovers the truthfulness of Scripture and the fact that Belshazzar was a king of Babylon, although he's not recorded in the history of it. But we'll talk about that in chapter 5. But we're told here he's in the province of Elam by the river Ulai. Basically in the palace in Shushan, this was like a winter residence, a winter getaway for the king of Persia. And if you read the books of Esther and the book of Nehemiah, those books take place in this same area. And so it's about east-northeast of Babylon area right there. You can see it on the map. Susa being Shushan in the palace, in the citadel. So basically, let's keep going in 3 through 21. "Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before a river a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, and behold, a he-goat came from the west, on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came a fourth little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. And it cast down truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And it came to pass, when I, even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which is called, and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in deep sleep on my face toward the ground. But he touched me and set me upright, and he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. And he said, The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. And the rough goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So, according to Scripture, we have this image of a ram. It has these 2 horns, one's higher than the other. Then we have an image of this goat that's attacking and kills the ram. Now this is an image of a goat that has one massive horn, and you can tell very little bit that there's a little tiny nub down there for the second horn. But I bring this picture up just to go on a sidetrack, on a rabbit trail, if you will, to talk about unicorns, right? Now when we talk about unicorns, we think of Lisa Frank and the pretty, colorful white unicorn, or we think of Twilight Sparkle, right? I had to watch My Little Pony for a while, have daughter and everything, and my son taught me a neat little song, goes along with the theme song. It's like, My little pony, skinny and bony, stepped on a wire and caught on fire. You can tell I'm not much of a singer, but I think that song's kind of funny. But when we get the idea of a unicorn today, these are what we're thinking of. These mythological beasts and creatures. When in fact, that's a unicorn. This one-horned deer that was found in Italy. Or that's a unicorn of the sea. Or that's a unicorn of the zoo. And so Scripture does talk about unicorns, and sometimes critics, skeptics of the Bible, they want to point it out and be like, see, Scripture talks about unicorn. Unicorns aren't real. But let me show you something. It's very important to understand that words evolve. The words we use today may not have carried the same meaning hundreds of years ago. So if you're using a King James Version Bible written around the 17th century, 16th century, the words have changed in some fashion. For instance, the word unicorn, if you were to look it up today in any dictionary, you can read the primary definition as a mythical creature resembling a horse with a single horn in the center of its forehead. Okay? But if you were to go to Noah Webster's dictionary in 1828, you'll find that the primary definition of a unicorn was an animal with one horn, the monoceros, which is applied to a rhinoceros. And so, in the past, unicorn was a legitimate word term for an animal like a rhinoceros. But the word evolved today to make us think about Twilight Sparkle. And so I just want to bring that up. So the Bible does talk about unicorns, but unicorns aren't this. Unicorns that the book of Job talks about were probably more similar to this when it's talking about the strength and the power of the unicorn. But enough on that side note. So we're told clear as day that the goat is this king of Greece. And we know the king of Greece that took over Persia was Alexander the Great. And we know the ram is the Persian Empire. Again, just like the bear was standing up higher on one side than the other, and here the ram's horn, one is higher than the other, it signifies that the Medes were the smaller group of the kingdom, and the Persians were the larger part of the kingdom, which is why that one horn was higher than the other. And so we keep reading in verses 22 to the rest. Now that, verse 21, the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper in practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. And he shall magnify himself in heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true, wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. So we're told that when Alexander the Great, when the goat destroys and kills this ram, that the horn will eventually be broken, and in its place 4 horns will pop up. Now this is a picture of a real goat, or sheep, if you will. It's called a Jacob sheep, and they're actually born with 4 horns, as you see here. Basically, if you know anything about Alexander the Great, when he died, his kingdom was split between his 4 generals, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And these 4 kingdoms were spread out. They never had the same amount of power that Alexander the Great had. Cassander and Lysimachus actually had very weak power. They weren't the strong of the 4. The nations, the king of the north was Seleucus, the king of the south was Ptolemy. When we get to Daniel chapter 11, we'll read much about the king of the north, king of the south, the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid empires. So these are the 4 kingdoms that's mentioned coming up after Alexander the Great. But then it talks about there is this little horn that grows up out of one of the 4. And that little horn is Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. We know this because, number 1, he comes up out of those 4 kingdoms, if you will. He comes up out of the Seleucus kingdom, the Seleucus empire, the Seleucid empire. And he fulfills the prophecies that Daniel has written here. Basically, he comes out from 175 to 164 BC at the date of his death in that area. He magnifies himself. He's one of numerous Seleucid rulers that has the nickname of Epiphanes. And basically, Epiphanes can be translated as glorious, illustrious, God manifest, basically arrogance, pridefulness. He thought he was Zeus manifest in flesh here on earth. And so, matter of fact, some people have given him the nickname of Epimendes, which means insane, I believe it is, madman. And so he clearly fits this criteria. And then it says that he takes away the daily sacrifice and casts down the sanctuary. Now, if we read Josephus's work, The War of the Jews, we find out that he comes upon the Jews with a great army and takes the city by force and kills a great multitude of those that favored Ptolemy, which the king of the south. He spoiled the temple, put a stop to constant practice of offering a daily sacrifice of expiation for 3.5 years. And he says Antiochus wasn't satisfied with any of this. He compelled the Jews to dissolve the laws of their country, to keep their infants uncircumcised, to sacrifice swine's flesh against the altar, and against which they've all opposed themselves. The most approved among them were put to death. So if you fought against them, he would go ahead and kill you. If you didn't obey and you didn't go ahead and sacrifice, then he would work on killing you. And so we definitely see this happening. Casting the truth to the ground. Well, the Jews, they're monotheistic. The Jews believe in the Old Testament, and they believe in the Torah, much of it, all of it. And basically, Antiochus IV was bringing in Hellenization, or Hellenizing the area, bringing Greek culture, Greek language, Greek arts, Greek religion, polytheism, and basically corrupting these people. Matter of fact, in the book, The Heart of Hebrew History right here, a lovely lady from a previous church gave it to me. It says that after he became king, Antiochus got into difficulties with people of Jerusalem by the appointment of a high priest that the Jewish people would not accept. Matter of fact, Antiochus in 169 BC had returned, plundered the temple, devoted himself to with fanatical zeal to bring Jews under control. Some Jews in Jerusalem accepted Hellenism and were persuaded by the king to join in his efforts to make all Jews conform. Many Orthodox Jews were imprisoned, 40,000 were slaughtered, and an equal number of Jews were sold as slaves. So here, we're going to get to this in Daniel chapter 11 as well. But here you get Antiochus IV getting some of the Jewish people to go on his side and betray their kinsmen, their countrymen. You imagine that happening, an American betraying one of us for ISIS or for some of the North Korea, whatever the case is. And you get these cowards out there and everything, and it's treason. And I just couldn't imagine that happening back then with these 40,000 that are killed. But we see Antiochus IV fulfilled that. And then they corrupt and they morally pervert the sanctuary and the people and everything. We see this with the Hellenization as well. And so here this little horn is not the Antichrist. It's not the Antichrist of the little horn of chapter 7. We know clear as day, chapter 7, that fourth beast is actually the kingdom, the fourth kingdom and Antichrist kingdom that comes. This little horn clearly fits the description of Antiochus IV. He comes up out of one of those four Greek empires, the Seleucid Empire, and it says, in the latter time of their kingdom. So in the latter part of the Greek time period, I think Alexander the Great died around 323 BC, so he conquered the area before then, and the Romans, I want to say, took over around the 1st century BC, and so this is definitely near the latter part of the end of that time, their kingdom. So this is clearly talking about Antiochus IV's epiphanies. Then it also says down there in verse number 25 that he's going to be broken without hand. He's not going to die in battle. Like his father and many before him, they were killed in battle. There's two schools of thought on how Antiochus IV died. Number one is the fact that he was poisoned by Heliodorus. The second one is the belief that he struck by an illness and died from that. Either way, either case, it wasn't dying from battle or from warfare. And so this is scripture being fulfilled by Antiochus IV as well. We know that the Antichrist will be killed by hand, not human hand, but by the hand of God. And so that's point of clarification and distinction between Antichrist and Antiochus IV. But it's important to note that Antiochus IV is a type of Antichrist. But moving on, talking about 2,300 days, what happens for these 2,300 days that are spoken of in verse 14? So the feasts are annulled. All the Jewish feasts, you got the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Trumpets, Feast of Lights, Feast of just the different types of feasts. You know what they are. If not, look it up, okay? But I'm having a blank right now. Let me get a little more of this. Okay, the Day of Atonement. There you go. There's one of them. But basically, they're not able to practice their religion. They're forbidden to read scripture. And with the Psalms, they have Psalms of Ascent that they would sing. Their Shema is Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. They're not allowed to read those. They're not able to perform circumcisions. Back in the heart of Hebrew history, we read that the Jews were forbidden to do circumcision. Matter of fact, it says, 2 Jewish women defied his edict and had their boys circumcised. When apprehended, they were led through the streets with their children fastened to their neck. They were thrown headlong over the steepest part of the walls. So that's Antiochus IV, despicable, wicked, evil man, a type of Antichrist. And we also read that Antiochus IV defiles the temple, puts an image and a statue of Zeus in there, and sacrifices a pig on the altar and splashes the temple compounds with the blood and the broth. We see all that happening. But then in verse 14 it says the sanctuary will be cleansed. Now it's historically documented that 25 Kislev in 164 BC that the temple was cleansed from this defilement. And so it begs the question, when do the 2300 days begin? And I'm thinking if Daniel had this vision, he's writing this down, if the people during Antiochus IV's days, had the scroll of Daniel, then they may have been able to know when these days would be and when Antiochus IV, or this wicked king ruler, would be persecuting them. And basically, you can find that out because we know the temple was cleansed. But the question is, when is the 2300 days going to begin? And so if we know when the days begin, if we can point it to one or two areas, then we know when the temple is going to be cleansed if you're at that time period in history looking forward. It's easy for us to look back and everything, but for them looking forward, if they can figure out when are these 2300 days starting, they can know how long do they have to get through until the temple's clean. There's two schools of thought. One of them is the fact that the 2300 days is, the Hebrew word actually means evening mornings. And they look at Exodus chapter 29, those verses there, where it talks about there's 2 daily sacrifices, one in the morning and one in the evening that is done. And that 2 offerings a day for 2300 days is 1150 evening morning offerings. So they look at this for 3.5 years or so, close to 3.5 years. And so if we are looking back and we see that the temple was cleansed 25 Kislev of 164 BC, then what happens about 3 years prior to that? Well, according to 1 Maccabees, 15 Kislev of 167, that is when Antiochus sets up this Zeus statue and defiles the temple. And so it could have started then. But the second idea is the fact that these are just literal days, 2300 days. If a Jewish person, according to their day of reckoning, they count 360 days in a year, and they go ahead and look at 2300 days divided by 360 is a little more than 6 years. And so if the cleansing of the temple was 25 Kislev of 164, what happened 6 years prior to that? Well, 6 years prior to that, according to 1 Maccabees chapter 4, one of the high priests, the Jewish high priest, Onias, was murdered, ultimately beginning the persecution from Antiochus IV around 170 BC. And so if that's when the 2300 days begin, they had a little over 6 years of dealing with this suffering and this persecution until the temple's cleansed. Which brings me to really a final point of Hanukkah. In John chapter 10, verse 22, John writes about a time called the Feast of Dedication. It's also called the Feast of Lights, and basically this is the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. And what Hanukkah represents is it looks back to this period in which the Jewish people rededicated the temple. They cleaned it and rededicated it back to God. So that's what the purpose of Hanukkah is. The whole thing about the menorah there is tradition says that when they were working on rededicating the temple and cleaning it and everything like that, they found only a very tiny bit of oil that was used for the light. And basically the light had to be burned continually for a numerous amount of days. And basically the amount of oil that they found was only a very little bit for one day. But somehow God miraculously allowed that little tiny bit of oil to last until they were able to make more. And so the Feast of Lights, Feast of Dedication, sort of looks back to that when God also miraculously provided the oil that they needed for the dedication of the temple. Amazing stuff. But in the end, this fourth little horn of the goat is Antiochus IV. He's a type of Antichrist. When we get to Daniel chapter 11, really the first half of it's going to talk a lot about the north and the south kingdoms, the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid empires. But then around verse 21, it's going to start getting into Antiochus IV. But then there's going to be a dramatic shift from Antiochus IV to the Antichrist between 35 and 36. And we see Antiochus IV is a clear type of the Antichrist that is to come on the scenes in the last days. We also see that this is historically fulfilled. Now Daniel's writing this in 6th century BC, and yet we see this being fulfilled about 400 years, 500 years or so after the fact. It's amazing to see prophecy fulfilled. But all this goes, if it's all just knowledge, it means nothing. If we have to find some way to apply it to our lives and figure out, why do we even care? How does it matter to me? Why does it matter to me? And first, again, like I said, time again, there's going to be another one like Antiochus IV who's going to seek and come to destroy the Jews. The Jews have a very big role in the end times in returning Messiah. Israel has a very important role as well. That's why replacement theology, which I'll get a video on, is very dangerous because it removes the Jews, it removes Israel. Second, seeing this prophecy and seeing it fulfilled declares the inerrancy and inspiration of Scripture. Being able to see not only this, but in other chapters of Daniel where Daniel clearly identifies Alexander the Great, and we see that it's being fulfilled. It's just amazing because also seeing that prophecy fulfilled in the past gives us assurance of knowing the prophecies that God has for us yet to come. It gives us assurance knowing that it will happen because God is a man of his word. He is a keeper of his word. He is the promiser. And so it just gives that sort of assurance. So I hope you enjoyed Daniel chapter 8, the goat and the ram. We'll be getting on to chapter 5 of the book of Daniel because chronologically that's what follows next. So thank you and God bless.